right, thank you for that introduction. Thank you to everyone for being here today. Thanks to the organizers for having me. Thrilled to be here. I am Cheeky. I'm here to talk to you about the Protocol Guild. I definitely need a clicker though. Here we go.
Hey.
The big green button.
Big green.
Boom. We're going to talk about the Protocol Guild, specifically 3 parts of the Protocol Guild. Number 1, why is it needed? Number 2, how does it work? And number 3, a little something that we like to call the Protocol Guild Pledge. But let's start by looking at this beautiful, relaxing picture that I stole from the Ethereum.org website. It's pretty, right? Do you think it represents Ethereum well? Do you think that if you sent this image to your non-crypto family and friends, that they would understand what Ethereum is all about? Probably not, right? But I would bet that if I were to ask 10 of you what Ethereum is, I will get at least 5 different responses. Darn, I'm not going to ask you. Some of you might call it a world computer. Others might call it a settlement layer. Someone might say an infinite garden. Hey, that looks like the background. And God forbid, one of you might even say it's Bitcoin plus smart contracts. But you know what? None of you would be wrong. And so it brings up the question, is it really possible for Ethereum to be all these things at the same time? Yes. Yes, I think it is possible. There are so many ways to use Ethereum, thus there are so many ways to describe it. And that's kind of the point. Ethereum is what we make of it. And to that extent, we can kind of think of Ethereum as a commons, right? Like a forest or fisheries. What is a commons? It's a shared resource. It's an area that is accessible to and used by the public. To quote Trent Van Epps, Ethereum as a commons is such a useful frame. Anyone can contribute, anyone can see the constraints directing labor, and anyone can use or produce the shared resources. Unfortunately, like all commons, this resource can be abused. And I am, of course, talking about the tragedy of the commons. That's why I have Moloch here, the god of sacrifice. There he is, sacrificing some children. Sorry about that. If you've been in Ethereum long enough, you know that we like to refer to Moloch when we're talking about coordination failures. And the tragedy of the commons is, of course, a huge coordination failure. What is the tragedy of the commons? Well, it's when people act in their own self-interest, depleting shared resources to the detriment of everyone else. How does this apply to Ethereum? Well, we have a situation where we have a relatively small group of underpaid core protocol contributors who are responsible for infrastructure that is securing billions in value. And this is what Amin was tweeting about here when he said that one of the most important coordination problems facing Ethereum today is the tragedy of the commons that exists around funding core protocol development. Said another way, today financial incentives for Ethereum's core protocol work only provide a fraction compared to other similar work in the ecosystem. And so to visualize this, you can see here we have this chart. Ethereum's core protocol development is at the bottom left. It's low risk, low reward. But what this chart also shows us very clearly is that if you were to just go a little bit up the risk curve, you can significantly increase your rewards. For example, by working for a large crypto project like an exchange or a layer 2. And this is bad. This is not good because it essentially means that it is not economically rational to work on Ethereum's core protocol. Why? Well, because Ethereum's core devs, they're superstars, right? They have unbelievably specialized knowledge that so many projects would pay so much money to have. Why does this matter? Well, because Ethereum is very far from being done. In the next 5 to 10 years, there's a slew of unbelievable upgrades that are going to make Ethereum so much better than it is today. But for that to happen, it is imperative that we are able to retain and onboard Ethereum's core protocol contributors over the long term. So this raises this existential question for Ethereum. How can we rebalance financial incentives to make Ethereum's core protocol work economically rational on a risk-adjusted basis? So let's brainstorm. Can we rely on altruism, right? People just donating out of generosity of their hearts. Well, there are examples of this. If you follow Vitalik on Twitter, you may remember that until recently, his Twitter bio said, "I will not send you ETH." But he lies. He used to send ETH. This is a thread from 2018 where Preston Van Gloon from the Prism client team bemoaned the lack of funding for his client. Vitalik replied, YOLO, and sent him 1,000 ETH. That was worth $100,000 at the time. Today it's worth like $3 million. Can we rely on this? No, it is not sustainable. We also have a slight risk of capture. We don't know what these people are after. We don't know if they're going to start asking for something in return. And also, not all core devs are on Twitter asking for money, right? So these donors, they don't necessarily know who is in need of what. How about making Ethereum's holders pay for Ethereum's core protocol development? Well, that was actually proposed as well. Back in 2020, there was a CIP that proposed to set aside a portion of block rewards to fund Ethereum's core protocol work. Of course, it was soundly rejected for not being incredibly neutral. Ethereum is about giving power back to the people, not about developers inserting a paycheck for themselves every single block. It's also very hard to change. We need to be very thoughtful about what kind of changes we put into Ethereum's protocol. And it's a slippery slope. If we make an exception for this, who's to say some other group doesn't come in and say, hey, we also want to get paid this way. So there must be a better way. Social norms. What if we build social norms about funding Ethereum's core protocol development? We have this tweet from Danny Ryan in October of 2021, where he said, make it a social norm for all DAOs and network tokens to building on Ethereum to allocate 1.5% to the individuals building and designing the L1 infrastructure they rely on. Now, this is a very interesting idea. It does a lot of things very well. It's targeted towards individuals, not teams. It gives those individuals exposure to the upside of the ecosystem. It has a low risk of capture if everyone's doing it. It's sustainable if everyone's doing it. It can be credibly neutral depending on how those funds are distributed. And it will be a cost borne by projects, not Ethereum's holders or users. But it's missing a piece of the puzzle. Even if all these projects were willing to give a portion of their tokens, how would you distribute it to Ethereum's core protocol contributors? Can we rely on existing public goods funding programs to distribute this funding? I'm sure you're all familiar with these different funding programs, and they're all great in their own way, right? The fact that they apply to different types of grantees, that they have regular schedules that these grantees can rely on, and that they take on the operational overhead of running programs like this. But they all have different ways of distributing funds, batch holder voting, quadratic voting, committees, and none of these are necessarily the best option to help fund, or rather to help redirect funding towards Ethereum's core protocol contributors. So what can we do? Well, let's take a step back. What we want to do is we want to build social norms that projects built on Ethereum donate a portion of their tokens to ultimately help rebalance financial incentives for this work. What we need in the middle is a mechanism that distributes this funding in a way that is sufficiently fair, remains accurate over time, and also maintains Ethereum's credible neutrality. Who can guess what I'm about to talk about now? The Protocol Guild. It slots in very beautifully there. And to understand how the Protocol Guild works, you need to understand its two components, a list and a funding mechanism. What is the list? Quite simply, it's a membership registry of Ethereum's core protocol contributors. Who are these contributors? Here's all their names. There's 167 of them. There's some in this room. Say hi. Nice. 167 of them. And they're from all over the world, but to be honest, their names, not super useful. Let's talk about what they do. Broadly speaking, they're involved in three categories of work: client development, research and implementation, spec work, testing, security, infra, and coordination. Here are some of the teams. You've definitely heard of client teams like Get, Aragon, Nethermind. You've probably heard of research groups like the Robust Incentive Group. And you've probably heard of coordination teams like Ethereum Cat Herders. But Protocol Guild's membership is centered around individuals, not teams. So if, for example, you work biz dev at Nethermind, you will not be eligible. I'm sorry. Now, I also mentioned that these are active core protocol contributors. So let's quantify what I mean by active. To be eligible for membership, you need to have contributed for at least half a year. That's why our newest member is half a year old in Ethereum's ecosystem. But on average, the 167 members have been contributing to Ethereum's core protocol development for 3.4 years, whereas the oldest member has been contributing for over 9 years, proper OG. As a collective, they have contributed over 560 years, which is why we can very confidently say that Protocol Guild represents a collective of individuals who are stewarding Ethereum's core protocol. But you might be wondering, who's in charge of updating this list? Well, this list is actually self-curated, and by that I mean it is the existing Protocol Guild members who are responsible for adding and removing members. And if you think about it, this makes the most sense because most people don't have the necessary context or expertise to curate this list. Protocol Guild members, who again are core protocol contributors, they know who their peers are. They have all the necessary context, all the necessary expertise to be able to identify who the contributors are and track their contributions over time to make sure that this list is accurate both now and in the future. And when we launch our V2 contracts in, fingers crossed, 2 weeks, we will also have a Malk V3 DAO to instantiate those membership decisions on-chain for greater transparency. The net result of this list is that we have made the entire set of Ethereum's core protocol contributors directly legible on-chain. You can check out registry.theprotocolguild.eth for this smart contract registry, but don't check now, it's not live, check in 2 weeks. And also this Versal app, which is live, but on Zapolio. But we talked about rebalancing incentives. How does having this list legible on-chain help rebalance incentives? Well, we've built a funding mechanism around this list. And there's 3 interesting parts to this mechanism: donation, vesting, and distribution. So let's talk about each. We have created a single Ethereum address that anyone can use to donate tokens to everyone on this list, right? So we've removed all complexity associated with trying to have to figure out, oh, who should I donate to if I want to support Ethereum's core protocol stewards? Of course, by having this on-chain, it means it's totally transparent. You can see everyone who has donated, and you can see that indeed those funds are going directly to Ethereum's core protocol contributors. What happens to donated funds? They're vested. Specifically, our donation address is an immutable vesting contract that trustlessly vests funds over 4 years by default. Why 4 years? Well, because 4 years is pretty standard. And also, it obviously creates long-term incentives for these contributors to continue contributing in the future. Why did I say 4 years by default? Well, because hey, if you have a token and you think it's a great token and it should vest for longer than 4 years, no problem. Deploy your own 10-year vesting contract and redirect the vested funds to the membership, and that still works. But how are the funds actually distributed? Does every member get an equal share? No, they do not. We use time to determine each member's share. So the longer you've been contributing, the higher your share of donated funds. Again, we're creating long-term incentives. It's also a neutral distribution because all tokens are vested and distributed in kind. We don't swap them to ETH or stables or anything else. So for all these reasons, we think it's fair to say that the Protocol Guild's funding mechanism is simple and transparent while creating strong incentives to onboard and retain these contributors over the long term and enables Ethereum's ecosystem to fund its dependencies. That last part is super important because it conveniently leads me into the very last part of this presentation, which is the Protocol Guild Pledge. Who has heard of this before? Oof. I guess that means there's no one in here that's taking the Protocol Guild Pledge, right? No? Next year, more hands, guys, come on. About 3 weeks ago, Tim Bako, he revealed the Protocol Guild Pledge. Highly recommend you check out his Mirror post for all the juicy details that I do not have time to go over today. But what is the pledge? Quite simply, it's a commitment by projects building on Ethereum to donate 1% of their tokens, their native tokens, to the Protocol Guild. So, why native tokens? Why 1%? Why take the pledge? Let's answer those questions. Why native tokens? To give these contributors a diversified basket of tokens to give them exposure to the ecosystem, including the upside of this ecosystem, while remaining focused on their core protocol work. Of course, some of these tokens infer rights such as governance, so this is a great way to potentially get some of these individuals involved in your project. But please don't expect anything in return when you donate to the Protocol Guild. Why 1%? Why not $10 million? Well, because most projects can't donate $10 million, but every project can commit to a percentage of their tokens, and everyone can be celebrated for making the same proportional commitment. It's also easy to pledge. You can make this pledge before you even have a token. It also abstracts volatility, which means that if you make a $10 million donation, it will still be, it would not be $10 million in a bear market, for example, whereas 1% is always 1%. And lastly, 1% is more or less sufficient if we assume that approximately 1/3 to 2/3 of projects building on Ethereum take the pledge. Why take the pledge? To fund your dependency. If you've built on Ethereum, you have a dependency on it. You need these contributors to stick around to execute the unbelievable roadmap that we have planned. By taking the pledge, you help to rebalance those incentives. It also helps make Ethereum more resilient by providing another diversified funding stream that is more capture resistant. And of course, it scales Ethereum's values. Public goods are good, etc., etc. Remember this chart? That's not so nice. This is nice. We believe that with the Protocol Guild pledge, we can rebalance those incentives to make Ethereum's core protocol work economically rational on a risk-adjusted basis. Now, we have already had some people who have taken the pledge. Shout out to these 5 groups, or I guess projects. EtherFi was the first, then Pondal, then Tycho. How did they take the pledge? Very simply, they tweeted about it or forecastered about it. There are some of their examples of making those pledges. We are also tracking them on our June dashboard. This is the minimum viable product. We are going to be launching an NFT that we can send to projects to show that they have donated 1% of their token to the Protocol Guild. What if you don't have a token? What if you're not a project? No problem. So you see, the Protocol Guild has actually been around for 2 years already, whereas the pledge has only been around for like 3 weeks. And so in the last 2 years, we have received just under 5,000 donations of approximately $14 million in value, which is worth around $30 million today. And you can see our donor leaderboard here, a list of amazing projects, and the bottom half of that donor leaderboard is actually projects or individuals without a token who just donated ETH. So yes, we take ETH. You might be wondering, why is Optimism missing from this list? Wasn't the Protocol Guild the top recipient in the last 2 retroactive public goods funding rounds? Yes, we were, thank you very much. We have not received those funds yet, we're stuck in the KYC process. Lastly, you can see here that to date, over the last 2 years, we have distributed, on average, $115,000 to each Protocol Guild member. That's a good start. It's nowhere near enough to rebalance the incentives that we talked about, which is why we're here to implore all projects building on Ethereum to consider taking the Protocol Guild pledge so that you can help us rebalance financial incentives to make Ethereum's core protocol work economically rational on a risk-adjusted basis, and thereby help us safeguard the future of Ethereum's core development roadmap. Thank you very much. Yes, sir?
How do you judge the current traction of projects that are participating in this initiative? Do you think is what you were expecting? Were you expecting more? What's your
You mean projects who have taken the pledge?
Yeah, to participate actively.
Yeah, I think Protocol Guild will live or die by how recognized it is as like a name, a brand, right? When people start a project, we want them to instinctively think, oh, we should donate 1%. We are very far from that point. On the other hand, EtherFi, they announced that they were taking the pledge before we had announced the pledge. So we have been thrilled with the early results, but we are very far from where we need to be. And so, that's why help spread the word, we would really appreciate it.
How are you actually gauging contribution? Now you said it's over time, but how do you determine when I start, when I stop?
Yeah, so the self-curation process basically says you need to put a date that you started contributing, and then all Protocol Guild members will vet that date. And we can vet it by looking at GitHub pull requests or whatever else, right? And then we literally have smart contracts on-chain, in 2 weeks, they're on testnet. We will have smart contracts on-chain that are literally counting the seconds that you've been contributing during that time, with a modifier for if it's full-time or part-time. So we are literally counting the seconds of how long you've been contributing. Thank you very much.